What if the color of your skin determined whether you lived or died in a hospital emergency room? Marcus Brown's harrowing experience exposes a shocking reality many face daily. As Marcus clutched his chest in agony, he never imagined the most dangerous threat to his life wasn't his racing heart, it was the systemic racism deeply entrenched in healthcare. His story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about equality in medicine. Marcus Brown staggered through the hospital doors, his face etched with pain. Leila, his wife, supported him as they entered the pristine lobby of Westbrook Memorial, the most prestigious hospital in this affluent neighborhood. The stark white walls and polished floors seemed to mock their desperation. "Please, my husband needs help," Leila called out, her voice tight with worry. But her plea was met with indifference. The receptionist barely glanced up, gesturing vaguely towards a pile of forms. Marcus hunched over, his breathing labored, as Leila frantically filled out paperwork with shaking hands. The emergency room buzzed with activity. A diverse array of patients filled the waiting area, a mother cradling a feverish child, an elderly man with a nasty-looking cut, a young woman holding an ice pack to her swollen ankle. Yet amidst this bustle, Marcus and Leila seemed invisible. As minutes stretched into hours, Leila's concern morphed into frustration. She watched as other patients who had arrived after them were called back for treatment. A well-dressed businessman with a mild cough. A college student complaining of a headache. Each time the door opened, Leila's hope rose, only to be dashed when another name was called. Marcus slumped further in his chair, sweat beading on his forehead. His face, usually warm and expressive, had taken on an ashen pallor. Leila alternated between rubbing his back and approaching the desk, her pleas for help growing more urgent with each attempt. "He's getting worse," she insisted to the unimpressed receptionist. "Please, can't someone take a look at him?" The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly. 1 hour became 2, then 3. Marcus's pain seemed to intensify with each passing moment. Leila found herself studying the faces of the staff, searching for a hint of concern, a flicker of empathy. But their gazes slid past Marcus as if he were part of the furniture, just as Leila was considering more drastic measures, perhaps causing a scene or threatening to call an ambulance. A nurse finally approached. Her demeanor, however, did little to alleviate their distress. With a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield, she regarded them with barely concealed impatience. "Brown?" she called out, her tone flat and disinterested. As Marcus struggled to his feet, Leila hoped this would be the moment someone recognized the severity of his condition. But the nurse's eyes never quite met theirs, her attention already drifting to the next name on her list. As they followed her through the double doors, Leila couldn't shake the feeling that the clipboard in the nurse's hands wasn't just a tool for patient information. In this moment, it felt like a barrier, a physical manifestation of the invisible wall that had kept Marcus from receiving the care he so desperately needed. Beyond those double doors, a stark reality awaited Marcus and Leila, one where pain and urgency weren't always enough to warrant immediate care. How could a man in clear distress become virtually invisible in a room full of medical professionals? The exam room bustled with activity, but none of it seemed directed towards Marcus. A nurse rushed past, barely glancing their way as she ushered a young woman with a sprained ankle to a nearby bed. Moments later, an elderly gentleman complaining of dizziness was promptly attended to by a doctor. The contrast was jarring. Marcus, doubled over in pain, remained unacknowledged. Leila's frustration mounted with each passing minute. Her eyes darted between her suffering husband and the flurry of activity around them. She watched as a mother with a feverish child received immediate attention, the doctor's gentle reassurances carrying across the room. The disparity in treatment was glaring, and Leila felt a knot forming in her stomach. Marcus gripped the edge of the exam table, his knuckles white with effort. Every breath sent a fresh wave of agony through his chest, yet he remained silent. Years of conditioning to avoid drawing attention, to not be seen as difficult or angry, warred with his desperate need for help. He caught Leila's worried gaze and attempted a weak smile, not wanting to add to her distress. the weight of their invisibility pressed down on them both. Studies have shown that unconscious bias in medical settings can significantly impact patient care, with racial and ethnic minorities often receiving less attention and pain management. This silent discrimination played out before them, each moment of neglect a stark reminder of deeply ingrained systemic issues. Leila's resolve strengthened. She approached a passing nurse, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "Excuse me, my husband is in severe pain. We've been waiting for hours. Can someone please examine him?" The nurse nodded distractedly, promising to inform the doctor, but Leila couldn't shake the feeling her words had fallen on deaf ears. As the minutes ticked by, the anticipation grew unbearable. Would Leila's advocacy finally break through the invisible barrier surrounding them? Marcus's breathing became more labored, each gasp a silent plea for help. Leila alternated between soothing murmurs of comfort to her husband and anxious glances towards the door, willing it to open. Finally, a doctor entered, his white coat a beacon of hope. But that hope was short-lived. He gave Marcus a cursory glance, asked a few perfunctory questions, and scribbled something on a chart. Before either Marcus or Leila could fully explain the situation, he was gone, muttering about running some basic tests. The brief interaction left them reeling. As the doctor's footsteps faded, Marcus slumped back onto the exam table. The weight of invisibility settled on his shoulders, heavier than ever. In a place meant for healing, he felt more unseen and unheard than he ever had before. Invisible no more, Marcus now faced a different kind of erasure. As the doctor approached, clipboard poised like a shield, a chilling question hung in the air. In the eyes of modern medicine, can bias overrule even the most glaring symptoms? The exam room felt suffocating as Marcus struggled to find the right words. His chest tightened with each labored breath, the pain radiating through his body. "It's like a crushing weight," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Been getting worse for hours." The doctor's eyes never quite met Marcus's, instead flicking between his clipboard and the monitors. His perfunctory nod did little to acknowledge the gravity of Marcus's distress. "And when did this start?" he asked, his tone flat and disinterested. Leila watched the exchange, her hands clenched at her sides. She could see the doubt creeping into the doctor's expression, the subtle dismissal in his body language. Every instinct screamed at her to intervene, to demand the care her husband deserved. But years of conditioning, of being taught to respect authority, especially in medical settings, held her back. The examination was brief, almost insulting in its cursory nature. The doctor's stethoscope felt cold against Marcus's skin, a fleeting touch that seemed to barely register the rapid, irregular heartbeat beneath. Marcus winced as fingers prodded his chest, the pain spiking sharply. Yet the doctor's face remained impassive, unmoved by the clear signs of distress before him. Leila's internal conflict reached a boiling point. She opened her mouth to speak, to insist on more thorough tests, but the words caught in her throat. The fear of being labeled difficult or aggressive warred with her desperate need to advocate for Marcus. In that moment of hesitation, the doctor had already turned away, scribbling on his chart. The tension in the room was palpable. Would this be the moment when Marcus's suffering was finally recognized? When the veil of prejudice would lift, revealing the true nature of his condition? Leila held her breath, hoping against hope for a breakthrough. "Well, Mr. Brown," the doctor said, his tone carrying a note of finality, "based on my examination, I believe you're experiencing a panic attack." The words fell like a hammer blow, shattering any remaining hope. "It's not uncommon, given the stress of daily life. I'll prescribe you some anti-anxiety medication." Marcus and Leila exchanged a look of disbelief. How could hours of intense, physical pain be dismissed so easily? The prescription was thrust into Leila's hands, a flimsy piece of paper that felt woefully inadequate against the weight of their concerns. As they left the exam room, the fluorescent lights seemed harsher, the hallway stretching endlessly before them. They had come seeking answers and left with nothing but a hollow diagnosis and a growing sense of unease. The prescription in Leila's hand felt like a mockery of proper care, a bandage applied to a wound that ran far deeper than anyone in that hospital seemed willing to acknowledge. Leila grips the steering wheel, her knuckles white with tension. She glances at Marcus, his face etched with pain that no prescription can erase. As they pull away from the hospital, a startling statistic echoes in her mind. How many lives are lost each year to medical bias? The car glides through the night, a capsule of unspoken fears and frustrations. Marcus slumps in the passenger seat, each breath a labored effort. The prescription bottle rattles in the cup holder, a hollow reminder of their fruitless hospital visit. Leila's eyes flick between the road and her husband, her heart constricting with every pained gasp he tries to suppress. Marcus stares out the window, the passing streetlights casting fleeting shadows across his face. His chest burns with each inhale, but the physical discomfort pales in comparison to the emotional turmoil raging within. Doubt creeps in, insidious and persistent. Was the doctor right? Is this all just in his head? Leila's hands tighten on the wheel as anger surges through her. The dismissive attitude of the hospital staff replays in her mind, each remembered slight stoking her fury. Yet beneath the anger, Uri gnaws at her. What if they missed something serious? The weight of responsibility settles heavily on her shoulders. As they stop at a red light, Leila turns to Marcus. We should get a second opinion, she says, her voice tight with concern. Marcus meets her gaze, conflict clear in his eyes. The fear of being dismissed again wars with the need for answers. He nods slowly, wincing as another wave of pain washes over him. The silence stretches between them, filled with unasked questions and unvoiced fears. Leila's mind races, recalling articles she's read about misdiagnosis rates and their potentially deadly consequences. The statistics are grim, especially for patients of color. Each passing minute feels like a gamble with Marcus's health. They pull into their driveway, the familiar sight of home offering little comfort. Marcus struggles out of the car, leaning heavily against the door. Leila rushes to his side, supporting him as they make their way inside. The prescription bottle sits forgotten in the cup holder, a symbol of inadequate care. In their bedroom, Marcus sinks onto the bed, exhaustion etched in every line of his body. Leila helps him change, her touch gentle, belying the storm of emotions within her. As she turns off the light, she knows sleep will be elusive for both of them. In the darkness, Marcus's labored breathing fills the room, a constant reminder of the battle they face. Leila lies awake, her mind churning with plans for tomorrow. She'll make calls, research specialists, demand better care for Marcus. As the night deepens, one thought crystallizes in her mind: they won't be invisible anymore. Whatever it takes, she'll make sure Marcus gets the help he needs. The quiet of night can be deceptive. While Leila plots their next move, Marcus's body sends increasingly urgent distress signals. How long before the whispers of discomfort become screams of agony that can no longer be ignored? Darkness envelopes the bedroom, broken only by the soft glow of the digital clock. Marcus shifts restlessly, each movement accompanied by a sharp intake of breath. The pain in his chest, once a dull ache, now pulses with renewed intensity. He tries to find a comfortable position, but relief eludes him. Leila lies beside him, her eyes wide open in the darkness. She listens to Marcus's labored breathing, her own heart racing with growing concern. Every gasp, every muffled groan, sends a jolt of fear through her. She reaches out, her hand finding his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. Marcus, she whispers, her voice trembling, maybe we should go back to the hospital. He shakes his head, unwilling to face another dismissal. It's just anxiety, he mutters, echoing the doctor's words. But even as he speaks, doubt creeps into his mind. This feels different, more intense than before. As the night wears on, Marcus's symptoms escalate. Sweat beads on his forehead, his skin clammy to the touch. The pain radiates down his left arm, a sensation he tries to dismiss but can't ignore. His breaths come in short, sharp bursts, each one a struggle against the vice-like pressure in his chest. Leila sits up, switching on the bedside lamp. In the sudden light, she sees Marcus's ashen face, his eyes wide with fear. "Marcus, this isn't right," she says, her voice stronger now, fueled by a mixture of love and terror. "We need to call for help." Marcus tries to respond, but the words catch in his throat. A wave of nausea washes over him, followed by a dizzying lightheadedness. He attempts to sit up, but his body betrays him. The room spins, and he collapses back onto the bed, his vision blurring at the edges. In that moment, the truth becomes undeniable. This is no panic attack, no bout of anxiety. Something is terribly, frighteningly wrong. Leila watches in horror as Marcus's eyes roll back, his body going limp. Her paralysis lasts only a second before instinct takes over. She lunges for her phone on the nightstand, her fingers trembling as she dials 911. "My husband," she gasps into the phone, her voice cracking with urgency. "I think he's having a heart attack. Please, we need help now." As she gives their address to the dispatcher, Leila's free hand finds Marcus's, squeezing tightly. The night that began with whispered worries has erupted into a desperate race against time. The true nature of Marcus's condition can no longer be denied or dismissed. Now, all they can do is wait for the wail of approaching sirens, each second stretching into an eternity. The wail of sirens grows louder, a beacon of hope cutting through the night. But as help races towards them, a chilling question hangs in the air: how much damage has already been done by hours of neglect? The front door bursts open, and two paramedics rush in, their movements precise and urgent. Leila, her face tear-stained and exhausted, points them towards the bedroom. "He's in here," she calls, her voice cracking with emotion. The paramedics waste no time. They surround Marcus, their practiced hands moving swiftly to assess his condition. One attaches electrodes to his chest while the other checks his vital signs. The room, once silent save for Marcus's labored breathing, now buzzes with activity and purpose. Leila watches, a mix of relief and anger coursing through her. As one paramedic prepares and she finds herself recounting the earlier hospital visit, the words tumbling out in a rush. "They said it was just anxiety," she says, her voice tight with frustration. "They barely looked at him." The lead paramedic glances up, his expression grim. "How long ago was that?" he asks, his tone professional but tinged with concern. "Hours," Leila replies, the weight of that time hitting her anew. "We should have come back sooner, but..." She trails off, guilt and fear closing her throat. The paramedics exchange a look, their efficiency never faltering. They work in tandem, their movements a stark contrast to the dismissive treatment Marcus received earlier. One administers medication while the other prepares the stretcher. "We're going to take good care of him," the female paramedic assures Leila, her voice steady and kind. "Every second counts in cardiac events, but we're here now." As they carefully move Marcus onto the stretcher, Leila can't help but wonder, will this care be enough? Will they be able to undo the damage caused by hours of dismissal and delay? The journey down the stairs and out to the waiting ambulance feels both agonizingly slow and dizzyingly fast. Leila clutches Marcus's hand, unwilling to let go even as they load him into the vehicle. The paramedics work around her, their movements practiced and sure. "Ma'am, we need to go now," the driver says gently but firmly. Leila nods, stepping back. The doors close with a finality that sends a shiver through her. As the ambulance pulls away, its sirens piercing the night once more, Leila stands alone in the driveway. The house behind her feels cavernous and empty. She wraps her arms around herself, trying to process the whirlwind of the past few minutes. With shaking hands, she reaches for her car keys. The journey to the hospital stretches before her, a solitary path filled with fear and hope in equal measure. As she slides into the driver's seat, a single thought crystallizes in her mind: this time will be different. This time, Marcus will get the care he desperately needs. The emergency room doors loom ahead, a portal to uncertainty. But as Leila hurries towards them, she clings to a fragile hope. Perhaps here, in this different hospital, with the urgency of the situation impossible to ignore, they will finally find the help they've been seeking all along. In medicine, minutes can mean the difference between life and death. As Marcus is wheeled into this new emergency room, a clock starts ticking. Will the hours of neglect prove too costly, or can this team turn back time? The stark difference is immediately apparent. A team of medical professionals swarms around Marcus, their movements swift and purposeful. Leila watches, her heart pounding, as they transfer him onto an exam table. The chaos is organized, each person knowing their role in this intricate dance of emergency care. A doctor barks orders, her voice clear and authoritative. I need an EKG, stat. Get me his vitals and prep for blood work. Nurses move with practiced efficiency, attaching monitors and drawing blood. The beeping of machines fills the air, a stark contrast to the silent neglect of their previous hospital visit. Leila stands to the side, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Hope and fear war within her as she watches the flurry of activity. This is what they needed hours ago, she thinks, her throat tight with emotion. The weight of "what if" presses down on her shoulders. The doctor turns to Leila, her eyes kind but serious. We're running tests to determine what's happening. Can you tell me about his symptoms? Leila recounts the night's events, her voice shaking as she describes Marcus's pain and the dismissal at the other hospital. As Leila speaks, the medical team continues their work. An ultrasound technician glides a wand over Marcus's chest, frowning at the images on the screen. A nurse gently places an oxygen mask over Marcus's face, murmuring words of comfort. Time seems to stretch and compress simultaneously. Each moment feels endless, yet the activity around Marcus moves at a dizzying pace. Leila's eyes dart between the monitors, trying to decipher their meaning. The numbers and lines mean little to her, but she clings to them as tangible proof that something is being done. The doctor studies the test results, her brow furrowed in concentration. Leila holds her breath, bracing herself for the news. The anticipation is almost unbearable. What will the diagnosis reveal? How much damage has been done by the hours of delay? Finally, the doctor approaches Leila, her expression grave. Mrs. Brown, I'm afraid Marcus has suffered a heart attack. The words hit Leila like a physical blow. She sways slightly, steadying herself against the wall. We're going to admit him immediately and start treatment. The next 24 hours will be critical. As the reality of the situation sinks in, Leila feels a surge of conflicting emotions. Relief that Marcus is finally receiving proper care battles with anger at the previous hospital's negligence. Guilt gnaws at her, should she have insisted on coming back sooner? The weight of "what if" settles heavily on her shoulders, a burden she knows she'll carry for a long time to come. Relief gives way to a chilling realization. Every test result, every medical detail paints a damning picture of what should have been done hours ago. But the true shock is yet to come. What hidden truth will push Leila past her breaking point? Dr. Chen's face grows increasingly grave as she reviews Marcus's test results. She turns to Leila, her eyes filled with a mix of concern and barely concealed anger. Mrs. Brown, I'm afraid the situation is more serious than we initially thought. Your husband has suffered significant damage to his heart muscle due to the delayed treatment. Leila's hands begin to shake as she tries to process this information. The doctor's words seem to echo in her head, each one a painful reminder of the hours spent waiting, pleading for help that never came. How bad is it? She manages to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Doctor Chen takes a deep breath before continuing. The blockage in Marcus's coronary artery has been there for hours. If it had been caught and treated immediately, we could have prevented much of this damage. She pauses, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. Mrs. Brown, may I ask about your experience at the previous hospital? As Leila recounts their ordeal, Dr. Chen's expression darkens. Her fingers tighten around the clipboard she's holding, knuckles turning white. This is unacceptable, she says, her professional demeanor cracking slightly to reveal genuine outrage. A basic EKG would have shown clear signs of a heart attack. The symptoms you described should have triggered immediate action. The doctor's reaction only fuels the anger building inside Leila. Questions she's been too afraid to ask begin to surface. Why were they dismissed so easily? Would things have been different if Marcus was a different color? Dr. Chen seems to sense Leila's turmoil. Mrs. Brown, I want you to know that what happened to your husband is not an isolated incident. Studies have shown that black patients are often undertreated for pain and face longer wait times in emergency rooms compared to white patients. She hesitates before adding, it's a systemic problem that we're working to address, but it doesn't excuse what happened to Marcus. Leila feels a surge of emotions, grief, rage, fear, threatening to overwhelm her. Her voice shakes as she asks, what happens now? Will Marcus be okay? Dr. Chen explains the treatment plan, detailing the medications and procedures Marcus will need. But Leila finds it hard to focus, her mind racing with the implications of what she's learned. As the doctor finishes speaking, Leila's resolve hardens. I want to file a formal complaint, she says, her voice steadier now, fueled by a burning need for justice. What happened to Marcus can't happen to anyone else. Dr. Chen nods solemnly, promising to connect Leila with the hospital's patient advocacy department. As Leila steps into the corridor, she feels as though she's crossing a threshold. The sterile hospital hallway stretches before her, no longer just a path to her husband's room, but a journey towards confronting the uncomfortable truths about healthcare inequality. With each step, her determination grows. This isn't just about Marcus anymore, it's about every patient who's been ignored, dismissed, or undertreated because of the color of their skin. The polished wooden door of the administrator's office loomed before Leila, a barrier between complacency and change. Behind it lay a system that had failed countless patients like Marcus. What truths would be revealed when that door opened? Leila took a deep breath, steadying herself before she entered. The room felt oppressive, with its dark wood paneling and imposing bookshelves. Hospital Administrator Dr. Thompson sat behind an expansive desk, his posture stiff and unwelcoming. Beside him, the hospital's legal counsel watched Leila with wary eyes. Mrs. Brown, please have a seat, Dr. Thompson said, his tone clipped. We understand you have concerns about your husband's treatment. Leila placed Marcus's medical records on the desk, her hands trembling slightly but her voice steady. Concerns is an understatement, Dr. Thompson. My husband nearly died because of negligence and bias in your emergency room. As Leila recounted their ordeal, she watched Dr. Thompson's face carefully. His expression remained impassive, but she noticed a slight tightening around his eyes. The legal counsel scribbled furiously on a notepad. Mrs. Brown, while we sympathize with your situation, you must understand that emergency rooms are complex environments. Decisions are made based on triage protocols and available information at the time, Dr. Thompson said, his words measured and rehearsed. Leila felt a surge of anger. And those protocols somehow missed a man in severe cardiac distress? Or did they just miss a black man in distress? The room fell silent. Dr. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mrs. Brown, I assure you that our hospital does not discriminate based on race or any other factor. Then how do you explain this? Leila pushed forward a study she had printed out. Research shows that black patients consistently face longer wait times and receive less pain medication than white patients with the same symptoms. How is that not discrimination? The legal counsel leaned in, whispering urgently to Dr. Thompson. Leila could see the conflict on the administrator's face, the desire to defend his institution warring with the undeniable evidence before him. We take these allegations very seriously, Dr. Thompson said finally, his composure cracking slightly. I assure you we will conduct a thorough internal investigation into your husband's case. Leila leaned forward, her eyes locked on Dr. Thompson's. An internal investigation isn't enough. This is about more than just Marcus. How many other patients have suffered because of unchecked bias in your hospital? What concrete steps will you take to address this systemic issue? The tension in the room was palpable. Dr. Thompson's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Leila feared he would dismiss her concerns entirely. But then his shoulders sagged slightly, a flicker of genuine concern crossing his face. "You're right, Mrs. Brown. This warrants a more comprehensive review. We'll bring in an external auditor to examine our emergency room practices and implicit bias training for all staff." As Leila left the office, she felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. The battle was far from over, but a small crack had appeared in the wall of institutional indifference. She walked down the corridor, her steps purposeful. This was just the beginning of a much longer fight for equality in healthcare, and Leila was ready for the challenge ahead. With a heavy sigh, Marcus adjusted his position in the hospital bed, wincing as the movement pulled at the tubes and wires connected to his body. The room, once alien and threatening, had become a sanctuary of sorts over the past week. The steady beep of monitors and the gentle hum of medical equipment provided a constant reminder that he was alive, despite how close he had come to death. Leila sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. The dark circles under her eyes betrayed the sleepless nights she had endured, but there was a fierce determination in her gaze. As a nurse entered to check Marcus's vitals, Leila watched her every move with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. "How are you feeling today, Mr. Brown?" the nurse asked, her voice kind but professional. Marcus managed a weak smile. "Better, I think. The pain isn't as sharp." As the nurse recorded his information, Marcus and Leila exchanged a look that spoke volumes. The physical healing was progressing, but the emotional scars ran deep. Each day brought new challenges, not just in Marcus's recovery, but in confronting the reality of what had happened to them. Once they were alone again, Leila leaned in close. "I've been doing some research," she said, her voice low and intense. "What happened to you? It's not an isolated incident. There are studies showing that Black patients consistently receive less pain medication and face longer wait times in emergency rooms." Marcus nodded slowly, his expression troubled. "I keep thinking about how different things could have been if they had just listened to us from the beginning." The weight of that "what if" hung heavily in the air between them. According to the research Leila had found, delays in treating heart attacks could lead to significant long-term complications. Each minute of delay increased the risk of permanent heart damage or even death. As they discussed the implications, their conversation shifted from their personal experience to the broader issue at hand. Marcus's eyes filled with a mix of anger and determination. "We can't let this keep happening to others," he said, his voice gaining strength. "There has to be something we can do." Leila squeezed his hand, her own resolve evident in her voice. "I've been thinking about that. What if we shared our story? Put a face to the statistics?" The idea took root, growing stronger with each passing day of Marcus's recovery. They discussed the potential risks and rewards, weighing the desire for privacy against the urgent need for change. As Marcus grew stronger physically, their commitment to action solidified. On the day Marcus was cleared to return home, they made their decision. Standing in the hospital room that had witnessed their pain and their growth, they looked at each other with newfound purpose. Their personal tragedy would not be in vain. It would become a catalyst for change, a voice for those who had been silenced or ignored. As they prepared to leave, Marcus took one last look around the room. "This isn't the end," he said softly. "It's just the beginning." Marcus's hospital bed became an unlikely platform for change. As he recovered, Leila began documenting their harrowing experience on social media. Her first post, a raw account of the negligence they faced, sent ripples through their community. Within hours, it had been shared hundreds of times, each repost bringing new voices to the conversation. The response was overwhelming. Messages of support flooded in, but so did stories from others who had faced similar discrimination. A black woman recounted being dismissed when she complained of severe abdominal pain, only to later discover she had a ruptured appendix. An elderly Latino man shared how his stroke symptoms were initially attributed to intoxication. As Marcus grew stronger, he joined Leila in sharing their story. They recorded videos from his hospital room, their voices steady but tinged with lingering pain and newfound purpose. Each post peeled back another layer of systemic bias in healthcare, exposing a problem too long ignored. Their advocacy wasn't without challenges. Trolls accused them of exaggeration or playing the race card. Some medical professionals became defensive, arguing that emergency rooms were simply overwhelmed. But for every negative comment, there were dozens more offering support and sharing resources. The Browns found themselves thrust into a role they never expected. Late nights were spent researching healthcare disparities and connecting with other advocates. They learned to navigate media requests and speak at community events, all while Marcus continued his physical recovery. Their efforts began to bear fruit. A local support group for victims of medical bias formed, providing a safe space for sharing experiences and resources. Marcus and Leila worked with civil rights attorneys to draft policy recommendations for hospitals in their area. As their following grew, so did the anticipation. Would their grassroots movement lead to real, lasting change? Or would it fade away, lost in the constant churn of social media outrage? The answer came sooner than expected. A local news station picked up their story, featuring Marcus and Leila in a primetime segment. The piece didn't just recount their experience, it dug deeper, exploring the systemic issues that allowed such discrimination to persist. The impact was immediate. Hospital administrators who had once brushed off their complaints now scrambled to schedule meetings. Local politicians began including healthcare equity in their platforms. What started as one couple's cry for justice had evolved into a rallying point for an entire community. As Marcus prepared for his final follow-up appointment, he and Leila reflected on their unexpected journey. They had become the voices they wished they'd had on that terrifying night in the emergency room. But they knew their work was far from over. The spotlight was shifting, illuminating the broader landscape of healthcare inequality. And they were ready to lead the charge for change, one story at a time. The Browns' story sent shockwaves through Westbrook Memorial Hospital, igniting a firestorm of introspection and urgent calls for change. The hospital board, faced with mounting public pressure and the threat of legal action, launched a comprehensive internal review. Every policy, every procedure came under intense scrutiny. Dr. Thompson, the hospital administrator who had initially bristled at Leila's accusations, now found himself at the center of a storm. He paced his office, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. The preliminary findings were damning, clear evidence of racial disparities in wait times, pain management, and overall patient care. As news of the review spread, tensions flared among the hospital staff. Some, entrenched in old ways of thinking, resisted the implications. "We treat everyone the same," insisted Dr. Reeves, a veteran ER physician, his voice tight with defensiveness. Others, like Nurse Chen, embraced the opportunity for change. "We've turned a blind eye for too long," she argued during a heated staff meeting. "It's time we face this head-on." The hospital rolled out a series of sweeping reforms. Mandatory implicit bias training became a cornerstone of their new approach. Every staff member, from the janitorial crew to the chief of surgery, was required to participate. The ER implemented a new triage system, one that relied on objective medical criteria rather than subjective assessments. Marcus and Leila watched these developments with a mix of hope and cautious optimism. They attended community forums, sharing their story and advocating for continued vigilance. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Marcus reminded a packed auditorium, his voice strong despite the lingering effects of his ordeal. "We have to keep pushing, keep demanding better." The conversation expanded beyond the walls of Westbrook Memorial. Other hospitals in the region, sensing the shifting tide, began examining their own practices. Local news outlets ran in-depth investigations, uncovering similar patterns of bias across multiple institutions. As the weeks passed, a question hung in the air: would these changes create lasting impact? Or would they fade away once the spotlight dimmed? Dr. Thompson, addressing a group of concerned citizens, acknowledged the uncertainty. "We're committed to this path," he assured them, his earlier defensiveness replaced by determination. "But it will take sustained effort from all of us to truly transform our healthcare system." The ripples continued to spread. State legislators began drafting bills aimed at addressing healthcare disparities. National medical associations issued new guidelines on equitable patient care. What had begun as one couple's fight for justice was evolving into a movement with far-reaching implications. Marcus and Leila, sitting in their living room surrounded by stacks of letters from supporters, reflected on the unexpected turns their lives had taken. "We never wanted to be activists," Leila mused, her hand intertwined with her husband's. "But now? Now I can't imagine doing anything else." Marcus nodded, his eyes fixed on the future. "This is bigger than us now," he said softly. "It's about changing the system, for everyone." As they turned on the evening news, another hospital announced a sweeping review of its practices. The local movement was growing into a national call for reform, and the Browns found themselves at the very heart of it. Marcus stood at the podium, his hands gripping the edges as he faced the packed community center. The room buzzed with anticipation, a sea of faces reflecting the diverse community that had gathered for this crucial forum on healthcare equality. As Marcus cleared his throat, the room fell silent, all eyes fixed on the man whose story had ignited a movement. "6 months ago, I almost died," Marcus began, his voice steady but laden with emotion. "Not because of some rare disease or tragic accident, but because of something far more insidious: systemic bias in our healthcare system." He recounted that fateful night, the pain that gripped his chest, the dismissive treatment at the first hospital, and the harrowing race against time that followed. As Marcus spoke, the audience listened with rapt attention. Gasps of shock and murmurs of anger rippled through the crowd. An elderly woman in the front row dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, while a young doctor shook his head in disbelief, his face a mask of shame and determination. Marcus's voice grew stronger as he continued, fueled by the energy in the room. "But this isn't just about me," he declared. "It's about every person who's been ignored, dismissed, or undertreated because of the color of their skin or the accent in their voice. It's about the lives we've already lost and the ones we can still save." Leila watched from the side of the stage, her heart swelling with pride and purpose. She saw in Marcus not just her husband, but a beacon of hope for their community. The man who had once lay helpless in a hospital bed now stood tall, his words a powerful call to action. As Marcus concluded his speech, the room erupted in applause. But this wasn't just polite acknowledgement, it was a roar of solidarity, a collective demand for change. People rose to their feet, some wiping away tears, others nodding with fierce determination. The forum moderator took the stage, her voice charged with energy. "Thank you, Marcus. Now, let's talk about concrete steps. We have representatives from local hospitals, community organizations, and government offices here today. How do we turn this momentum into lasting change?" What followed was a flurry of ideas and commitments. Hospital administrators pledged to implement new training programs and accountability measures. Community leaders proposed forming a watchdog group to monitor local healthcare practices. A state representative promised to introduce legislation addressing healthcare disparities. As the forum drew to a close, Marcus and Leila exchanged a look that spoke volumes. In their eyes was a mix of hope, resolve, and the weight of the journey ahead. They knew this was just the beginning, that real change would require sustained effort and vigilance. But for the first time since that terrifying night in the emergency room, they felt the full force of a community united behind them, ready to fight for a future where everyone receives the care they deserve. Marcus and Leila Brown's journey from victims of medical neglect to powerful advocates for change serves as a beacon of hope in the fight against healthcare inequality. Their harrowing experience in that emergency room, where Marcus's life hung in the balance due to racial bias, ignited a movement that continues to grow. The Browns' courage in sharing their story exposed the life-threatening consequences of systemic racism in medicine. Their voices, once ignored, now resonate in hospital boardrooms, community centers, and legislative chambers. Each time they speak, they chip away at the walls of indifference and prejudice that have stood for far too long, yet, the battle for equitable healthcare is far from over. The changes sparked by Marcus and Leila's ordeal are just the beginning. As more voices join the chorus demanding justice and equal treatment, the momentum builds. Every policy reformed, every bias confronted, brings us one step closer to a future where the color of one's skin never determines the quality of care received.